First of all, thanks for coming. We are very, very happy to have Koolhaas with us today. And well, I think it will be more an interview than a dialogue, but well, let's see what will happen. One first issue is about Europe. We are now in a, very close to the election day. So basically, Sunday at 11 p.m., we will know more or less what is going to happen. We had some really unexpected result from Holland, from Netherlands, and I'd love to know your comments on that. But basically, I think we have to a little bit consider how we try to do several efforts to support Europe in the last decades. But I guess that there is something related to the kind of disappearance of an intellectual elite in Europe related to politics. So if I think to what you have done with Romano Prodi, for instance, with your Atlas of Europe, OMA, and in that different scale also what other thinkers, other artists, other architects. I was part of an attempt with Barroso like 6 years ago. Barroso was a former president of the European Commission. We were asked to propose an idea of a new narrative for Europe, who was the same, you remember, you can imagine, so a bunch of thinkers who were working for 1 year. But finally, I think that what we have done was not used. I'm not sure if it's because it was irrelevant or because was maybe too much radical, but finally, there is this question, this issue about the relevance of the intellectual elite in Europe. I think that in America it's different, for instance. So there are artists, actors, thinkers that are much more protagonists in the political debate than what's happening here. I have no answer on that. Just one, maybe suggestion. It's that the lack of trust on the intellectual elite is in a way connected with a kind of effect related to the fact that probably in the moment of major risk, I think, to economical crisis, terrorism, now this climate change, the meritocratic elites in different fields were not ready to stay on the scene. So there is an amazing movie called Force Majeure. It's by Orplund. And in this movie, there is a story of the family with the father, 2 kids, and the wife. They go in French Alps for vacation, and they are taking rest on a terrace in a hotel in the Alps, and at a certain moment, there is an avalanche coming, no? And they say, oh my God, and all people are scared, but what's happening is that the father leaves, escapes from the scene, and the mother stays with the kids and the other part. So when they understand that the avalanche was controlled, there is no danger, honestly, and he come back. At a certain moment, he understood that there was something of definitively broken in this relation with the family. So force majeure, which is I think is a legal concept that is used to say, well, in a very emergency condition, you can decide to cut the rules, no? In a certain way, this syndrome of force majeure could explain how much populism was using this absence of trust in the meritocratic elite. So, but what do you think? Because I think this is very important to understand what could happen in Europe and what could be our role.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of important to communicate a little bit where this question comes from, because you and some other friends of us both in France, England, and Holland at some point, felt the need to become more involved in politics. You did it, and we all kind of really admired you and envied you for it. We try to do it in different means. And in that reason, this is an activity that actually started almost 20 years ago, or an impulse, I think also on your part. And we focused simply on the question, what can we do for Europe, and how is it possible to make this thing that we believe is so important more attractive and more vivid and more alive. And I think that you could describe it on one hand as a kind of series of courageous interventions, or you can also describe it as a series of interventions that actually missed the point. And maybe because first we thought it was about communication, and we did something kind of really eloquent in terms of communicating how Europe worked, because we thought the problem was nobody understands that. So the moment you show it, everybody will be kind of really happy and will kind of see the light. Then I had another episode, and that was perhaps close to your episode in politics, where I became the only non-politician in a group of 12 wise people that were going to describe the future of Europe. And then I had the kind of privilege to be part of a group that included Felipe González, Lech Walesa, real heroes who had achieved amazing transformations.
And this was when?
This started in 2006, and it ended, and that it was a real ending. It ended with a financial crisis, because the financial crisis kind of just made everything that we were going to do and everything that we suggested completely absurd. But anyway, it was unbelievably interesting to be part of that group. And basically in the first session, I can raise the issue because I think that is profoundly problematic in the current situation of Europe. That is it not absurd to talk about the future of Europe only with Europeans? And should we not have a kind of a Chinese person, an African person, and kind of some representation?
Or a Mediterranean.
Yeah, Mediterranean, yeah.
North African.
Yeah.
Or
North African, yeah. So basically, I took it upon myself to represent the voice from outside Europe. So I did interviews in China with politicians, and in Singapore and in Africa, and kind of every time I would kind of bring the kind of voice of those outsiders to into the core of kind of European thinking. And for instance, at some point, this was in 2006, way before the Arab Spring, with Kishore Mahbubani, a Singapore kind of thinker, we made a proposal that Europe, in order to show its capacity to engage and to communicate and to support Muslims, ought to pick one country, and we suggested Tunis, which at that point where later the Arab Spring actually emerged, and there show its potential for generosity, its potential for receptivity, its potential for understanding, maybe more than anything else. And so all those kind of notions were completely kind of swept away by the crisis and disappeared. But I also have to say that the European elite at that point had very little even understanding or knowledge of what was going on outside Europe. And I think that Europe constantly underestimates how much China wants Europe to exist, how much the Arab world needs Europe to exist, how much Russia is desperate for Europe to find some kind of form of engagement in spite of all the kind of signs of the opposite. So that was another kind of fiasco, you could say, but very interesting fiasco nevertheless. And I think that when during that whole kind of work on Europe, we began to understand that the first wave of European imagination and construction had been taken place among the intellectuals of Europe, and among the intellectual domain and the political domain, but that it had only been successful to the extent that it had not been kind of shared, and not really been shared with the population, so that it was, in a way, Europe fundamentally was a stealth project. That was done by stealth, unbelievably successful, but once it clarified, I think the kind of population kind of really woke up, and what the hell did you do to us, and what the hell what is this new situation, and what is the explanation? So I think the elite maybe succeeded by conceptualizing something kind of very smart and something urgent, but failed completely in terms of sharing their kind of motivation. And I think that is still what we're suffering now. But I now kind of pretty hopeful that the decay has gone so far that even in your generation there is a kind of sense, perhaps, and I really hope so, that it has to be kind of reversed, and that it can be reversed.
Yeah, so you mean we should probably do our best to make Europe aware of its relevance, of its global relevance, and no, but I mean say on that, because if we also go back to Brexit, I followed your intervention on Brexit on The Guardian, and so basically what is really paradoxical is what makes England one thing is Europe, basically, because without Europe, with Brexit, Scotland, Gales, so it's a confirm of what you're saying, that Europe is implicitly much stronger of how much we are aware of that. Yeah. And that could be something that has to be explored by the intellectual elite. And
well, maybe it's not really an intellectual thing. I think that Brexit is totally emotional, but I see here and there also a kind of corresponding emotional kind of feeling for Europe. And I think
what you're saying
that is
about
kind
the
of
exit
really
poll in England is that
now
needed. The Conservative Party is disappearing. So
and I think that the way the populists kind of use its lack of democratic content is absolutely crazy and completely dishonest, because what is threatening now to happen in England is the most paradoxical thing of all, that the Conservatives in the coming elections do not even have enough votes to have a single seat in the European Parliament, and that same party now has the kind of right simply because it has once been elected to destroy, first of all, England, and to damage in a kind of serious way Europe. If ever a kind of in undemocratic kind of situation, that is really it. But I also have to admit that I cannot imagine that is going to happen, that there is not going to be some kind of revolt against something so crazy.
Crazy. Well, just to go a little bit ahead about Europe, basically 20 years ago, you invited Sanford Quinter, Hans Ulrich, and Multiplicity and me to develop your idea about, well, it was a large exhibition in Bordeaux, Arc-en-Retz, was mutation, and what we did as Multiplicity Group was to work on this research called Uncertain States of Europe, and we were trying to see it in the amazing heterogeneity of city souls in Europe, was possible to select some common character. And we found that in a kind of wild capacity to self-organize some processes from the bottom. Well, but more in general, mutation was very important because honestly was anticipating a serious, maybe also a little bit board series of research studies, exhibition on the urban sphere. No? Well, if we, from our side, we continue to observe Europe. Well, at the end of the last century, there was this idea that Europe could be observed as like a kind of unique urban environment. No? So Europe as a city, or the other possible metaphor was Europe as a network of cities. So in a certain way, if we observe with attention what is happening, thinking to London and Brexit, thinking to what is happening in Paris and Gilets Jaunes, but also in a way Milano, with what's happening with the situation, let me say, the political tendency of the government. So this network of city is completely different from the perspective we had 20 years ago. So it's a network of, let me say, it's a small group of big cities, of capital city in a more substantial way, that have no relation with the network of small and middle-sized cities that are around them, and no relation with the local, with their nation. So cities that probably share among them more values, content, expectation, and interaction than what each one of them is sharing with his country. So that's a. Do you think this is Europe? Still Europe? What is European? Because that's. Well, help me to enter in a second question about countryside. But
I think the interesting thing that we are witnessing is that completely independent of any European issue, completely independent of any of our will, and completely independent of any one of our insights, inequality in the background kind of became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that inequality is now kind of being translated and having a huge and massive influence on the morphology of Europe and the condition of Europe.
Because I think that is more visible now.
Yeah, it's visible exactly in those kind of super cities that you mentioned, and the total separation between those super cities and the rest. And it's really kind of interesting that I experienced it almost physically myself, because I used to live in London, and now I live in Amsterdam, but living in Amsterdam is kind of barely an indication. I live in a kind of very amorphous, kind of almost non-urban, not quite suburban, but anyway, a condition that I think is perhaps much more European than what London represents or what Paris represents. And if from those perspectives, I wasn't in Paris just to get in and out, it's such a kind of horrendous complexity and complication that it's very logical that there are separate cultures and separate kind of political systems that survive there and that are oblivious to the rest. And in a way that was also, or became, I have to admit, not directly, deliberately, but a very important undercurrent of why I started looking at the countryside. Because I started simply away from cities.
You believe that all this will matter on the geopolitical scene in Europe, so we will see the results of the European election also from that perspective?
I don't know. I never, at some point I made a decision not to mention the words crisis in Europe in a single sentence. And to always at least pretend to be very optimistic, but that was also a genuine feeling that I think things are not as dire as they sometimes seem or as they are described. And there were results in the last election 2 days ago in the Netherlands that confirmed to some extent that optimism, where we expected the worst, i.e. that populist would become the biggest party, but where in the end the results were totally different and not nearly as dramatic and actually quite positive.
Great. Well, in a certain way, your research on countryside, it's an attempt, I believe, is an attempt to explore the other side of the universe. No? And it's quite interesting, I think, that, in a sort of way, what you did with Mutation is now, in a certain way, comparable in terms of the idea to explore a large, complex, extremely rich of variation, differentiation sphere. No? So my question is, I really wonder if you could a little bit tell us how it's going, this research that will come also an exhibition, in terms of if you think it's still really possible to work with this umbrella, so to make countryside a concept capable to cover the heterogeneity of landscapes, environments. That's one question, and then I have another question about melancholy, but that came after.
But maybe it's good if you pose that question at the same time, because then I can.
No, the question is more about what your relation with the concept of nostalgia. That was always a little bit, let me say, nostalgia. In the term nostalgia.
Nostalgia.
Nostalgia. I'm very sorry for my English, but nostalgia. And basically, nostalgia is you need or you feel a sentiment of absence in relation with someone who was part of the past. Nostalgia. Melancholy is the term that you are using when you talk about countryside in your text. And it's less related to the past. It's not necessarily related to the past. So in a certain way, it's more open. But first, I'd love you to talk about your countryside research.
Okay. Well, I think that basically we're in a kind of situation now that where almost simple motivations that eventually lead perhaps to actual insights can barely be discussed. And I think that, for instance, for Mutation, it's not that we kind of started and saying everything is different and there is kind of mutations. We were very much aware and motivated by the fact that we knew situations that are different from the archetypal ideals of architecture and the archetypal definitions of architecture. And that nevertheless we noticed that and I'm talking about you as well, that we liked them. Yeah, and so there was a kind of we almost didn't understand how is it possible that I like a Chinese city that if I use my judgment looks horrendous, or you have this landscape is a mess, but nevertheless I feel a deep affinity with it. So there were all these conditions. So it was also kind of correction, I think, to our own indoctrination and our own education. And we simply tried to put this otherness that was emerging on the agenda, and we particularly, and that is of course also connected to the whole idea of Europe. Europe is so ridiculously stable in its value and so completely reactionary in not wanting to change its values, that that is of course part of why it feels so ancient and so alienating, because that was our main motivation. We wanted to tell Europeans that you're allowed to like different things now, and you're allowed not to be nostalgic about the city. You're allowed to look at kind of modern conditions and not, it's not perfect, it's not kind of it doesn't have a center, it's not a composition, there's no control, and that was the main motivation. And in a very similar way, I think what we're trying to do with the countryside is kind of very similar. We discovered a number, and we is again not only me, but a group of people in which Nicholas Maak, a German writer, is a very important contributor. We discovered kind of situations that do not conform to what our judgment, our initial judgment tells us we should think. And I take an example in his case. He went to Rwanda and became very interesting in the issue of gorillas. Gorillas are kind of protected there. Gorillas...
Lake Victoria.
Huh? Yeah, near Lake Victoria. And only, I think, 10, 15 years ago, there was a kind of highly alarming, and this highly alarming is a kind of word that comes back every time. We live in a kind of period of highly alarming, where it doesn't seem that everything is ever anticipated, but everything continues until the moment it becomes highly alarming. Anyway, there was a highly alarming kind of report that only 200 gorillas were living. So immediately the whole apparatus of the state, the apparatus of the UN, the apparatus of, which is an enormous force in Africa, comes into action and starts preserving and kind of protecting the gorillas. Then the time goes on, and without necessarily wanting to make this kind of very important communication, the gorillas went from 200 to 800, and they're doing extremely well. They're extremely well because there is now a kind of new form of doctor that kind of enters the kind of jungle, and if a gorilla is sick, they kind of shoot it with a kind of medicine, and if the gorilla needs therapy, they get therapy. And all of that is kind of not officially noticed, and it's a kind of almost like mutation. So now there's a kind of vigorous tribe of gorillas that is incredible numbers, and that is basically overcrowding its assigned territory. And on the other side of the barrier, there is Africa, which is also doing very well, and also something we barely hear. And so therefore, there are two forms of overcrowding that are happening in the same kind of region. And so it's really, for me, the fascination is to look at the countryside, not how it was, not necessarily how, with the ambition to try to create a kind of unified definition for it, but simply countryside could be, we don't even bother to define it. It's everything which is not strictly speaking urban. And strictly speaking urban in the classical sense of the word, because you could of course see this whole thing, you know, the superposition of NGOs, local states, UN, and also a number of American primate experts that have been studying kind of the gorillas, and basically in every new generation develop a new theory of what the gorilla is about. And that is also in itself kind of very funny, the way the gorilla plays a role in ideology in American academia. So it's really, again, to trace those kind of again, mutations maybe.
But, well, just maybe a stupid question, but it's a concept of wild nature.
Wild nature?
Wild nature. Still there, still present in what you, in the field that you're observing.
No, in the field
under the umbrella of
what we are observing, there's no wild nature anymore.
No,
but it's not so much that it's maybe, yeah, I should correct that. There's of course plenty of wild nature, but for instance, the wildest nature is now the nature that has been bought by philanthropists and bought in order to preserve it.
Now, this is a very delicate issue because, no, please.
Huh? No?
No, I was saying that in itself, the notion of nature is often used in a very stupid and banal way. You know, so I always try to go back to different definitions of the idea of nature. I remember often how Foucault was talking about human nature has something which is basically unpredictable, violent, which comes not in the, let me say, in the outside world, but sometimes come from each of us. And he was trying to compare madness with the natural condition. And from a certain point of view, and that's the reason I'm asking you if nature is part of your countryside geography, I think that there are more natural phenomena in the urban sphere nowadays. So things in the urban environment instead of in what we are used to call the natural environment. So if you think to slums or informal settlement, there is something of natural in that environment, in the Foucault perspective, which are absolutely stronger than what we can see, as you were saying, in what we are used to consider the wild nature, which is outside the urban sphere. But
we're also not finished. We're finishing literally on the 20th of February next year. And I can't say exactly what we will kind of address still, or whether we drop certain things or actually kind of reintroduce certain things. And that is, of course, exciting about the time limit that you have for something. At some point it is finished, but until the last moment we have time to work on it.
Oh, that's great.
But what seems to be common in almost all the situations is extremism. So maybe not madness, but there is an extremism of climate, an extremism of technology, and extremism of ambition, and extremism
in the countries.
Yeah.
I think you are describing this crazy, amazing scale of data storage, things which are it's part of the countryside landscape now.
Well, it's going to be, but I think you shouldn't. Nobody should expect kind of really an exhibition that is kind of all about unknown things, because a lot of things is now already kind of common in a way. I think your exhibition here, contains many things that we are also interested in. I think it's more the cross connections that we're making that will make the difference.
Yes. Peter Fraze is an American thinker. He just wrote a book called Four Futures, and he was here last week to present the book. And in the book, he was trying to observe the future, trying to put together the processes of automations, and robotization, and on the other side, climate change. Was quite interesting because, well, from one point of view, he was saying, basically we are entering in a phase of humanity where robots will substitute men in many different fields, and this will produce, in a very, let me say, objective way, an abundance of goods and resources. On the other side, climate change could intervene, drastically cutting this abundance. So we could enter in a phase where the scarcity of resources will be the first basic condition for many countries in the world. Not everywhere, but so. And he was, I think, was interested trying to put together these two basic conditions and exploring what could happen. And he said, well, one of the possible scenarios is that communism is back, because in a certain way, we know that robotization and so on could not in a situation where the very famous sentence by Marx, from each related to its ability to each one related to its needs, could become something which should be present. Then he entered in a second part of the book where he said, but in any way we will have an elite who will run the robots. There will be an elite who will run the software, who will copyright the software, so the elite will be there. And at a certain moment, the elite probably will not need to have a labor force. So there will be a big mass of population who will be totally excluded or exterminated, he says. So, and then but well, it's a joke. Mm-hmm. But I'm interested to know what you think of communism has something which has left a legacy somewhere in the world, or something that in a different way, completely different way, could come back.
Okay, I would like to introduce a few seconds silence. It's a very it's
like a nightmare.
Yeah, or is it a nightmare? I mean,
I don't know. I really don't know.
Let me give you kind of first a superficial answer. First of all, there is one extremely large and successful state left in the world which calls itself communist, and which actually may be communist. And what we are looking at in the countryside is how that state is looking at its countryside, which is of course enormous. Slightly bigger than America, and what measures it is taking to keep the countryside a viable environment for a large part of its population. I think that the percentage now is maybe 60% in the countryside and 40% in cities, and it is typically assumed that it would be a nightmare if those other 60% also came into the cities and would overwhelm them and would turn them into chaos. So it is very true that, and this was a kind of really strange kind of moment in our own recent history, that we are working on the countryside, but the main ambition and main subject that China would dedicate its energies to and its political thinking to last year was also the countryside. So we worked in perfect parallelism with the Chinese state.
Yeah, they had the promise of 14 million of farmers and so are abandoning the countryside, and so every year. It's like
so
create a new Beijing every
year. It is there a kind of really serious issue. And so we've been looking at what the strategies the Chinese are doing.
Sorry, do you remember, I think it was 2000, we were together, invited us in Shanghai to propose themes for the expo, and countryside and agriculture was the first. And
we were so visionary.
But I remember the face of the
well, I think the funny thing is like that kind of something which at the time might be our own nostalgia for Mao posters that made us seem more intelligent than we were. But so the kind of seriousness is really massive. The means that are invested in it are really massive, and there's also considerable intelligence, for instance, in kind of mobilizing their own social media and tech companies to not only be kind of virtual, but also to have kind of physical representations, almost like a post office, in the most kind of remote sections of the country, so that they can contribute not only kind of simply getting rich, but also moving things in and out of the countryside and to undo the physical isolation. That's only one tiny example, but that is a form of thinking that I see there. And then they are at a scale that nobody kind of still can even conceptualize, realized fantastically intense kind of roads and railway network in 10 years, in the time that it took Europe in the 40 years to do what we have almost overnight. So that is also extremely helpful for kind of people in the countryside, almost to the point that you can reach from very deep into the country, the coast in a day, almost, and therefore And there's also a kind of more spontaneous movement to go back to the countryside. So the question is communism, is it either around the corner, does it still exist? Is it something we should begin to think about? For me, very important, because I always said that basically only China has the apparatus and the means to impose and to force its people to behave well in terms of global warming, and it's actually doing it. And it's not necessarily a kind of form of treating people badly, but actually removing the conditions that are causing global heating by force. And I think that is a huge hypocrisy of the Western world, that we somehow know that this is going on, and that we are unable, but also unable to even articulate that we somehow at some point also have to probably find harsher ways to deal with climate change than we are currently willing to deploy. And it's maybe only the kind of very young generation that is now protesting these climate change steps that we are taking, that clearly are not enough, and that clearly are not going to kind of lead to any of the kind of results we claim we will kind of reach. And so yes, maybe that is a harbinger, not so much of communism, but at least of another kind of awareness that this is an issue that cannot be dealt with by our current repertoire of intervention.
Well, yeah, no, I think it's in a way we could like a bipolarization. So on one side, only countries like China or India, but basically China, with a very authoritarian policy could change the mechanism. On the other side, I think that nothing more than climate change could make us aware of the necessity of a new idea of communism, sense of communities. That so we have to do everything all together now if we want to do something else, just pragmatic to a little bit, not in reverse, but slow down the acceleration of the process of trends of climate change. So from another point of view, I think what we have in Europe is that only if we have a really bottom-up movement, something could happen. No? But you're right that this is also the unbelievable differences of and differentiation that are happening in contemporary geopolitics. No? That there is no one future. There are probably, like William Gibson was saying, many futures connected with climate change. So climate change will straighten and exacerbate the differences.
Clarify.
The plan, no? Or maybe clarify. Okay, maybe two last issues. One, completely different, but maybe not. We are here, Triennale. We are hosting the 22nd edition of the International Exposition. I think it's great what Paolo Antonelli has done. Is absolutely great, and but Triennale, we know, has a long history in the short century, a long history of triennial exhibition. In 1986, you were here. The exhibition was about the future of city, so we are still in the same line. And you are here with OMA with a presence which is very strong, and basically what you did was to reinterpret Mies with a kind of reconstruction of the Barcelona pavilion, but with colors, with different shapes. You were there on the curve. I remember that there was this pavilion who was not following the same shapes, but trying to adapt itself to the Giovanni Muzio architecture, and also there are kind of way to introducing in the mythology, black and white mythology of the Barcelona pavilion, real life, no? The idea of a palestra. So just a few words about that, because I was curious to know what was the role of the ex-president in Triennale at that moment for you. And you know that we would love to have you here, again, in relation with Miss, but that's a part of the future. But then there is a more specific question about your relation with Miss. Someone could say your obsession, someone could say your well, complex dialogue.
Miss complex. So basically, I think that at the time there was kind of maybe much more appetite for adventure, and also kind of maybe slightly lesser seriousness. But anyway, just to explain to the audience what we did, we were invited as part of the Biennale. We got Triennale, sorry. We got a kind of section that was curved, and then I thought it would be. There was also a question at that time to reconstruct and to actually rebuild the Miss Pavilion in Barcelona, yes, which a couple of years after they did. And then we made a kind of reconstruction of the Miss Pavilion with all the remnants that we could still find in the Biennale, but unfortunately we were forced to do it in a curve, so not a single of Miss's right angles could be kind of copied. So it was obviously a parody, and then we also described what happened to all the kind of remnants. We described how kind of some of the marble ended up in East Germany, and basically we gave it a kind of further history, because we didn't, or I didn't like the idea of kind of doing a kind of reconstruction. And I still feel that that reconstruction has done a lot to reduce the aura of that, and maybe even of the impact of that kind of pavilion. That's all. But in terms of a Miss complex, what I think is strange is that kind of somehow at this point we are forced to
redefine him in a way, to rethink to him in a different political way.
No, what do you mean? No,
you are forced. We are forced to.
Yeah, we are forced
to redefine his political.
No, I think that we are forced in a way by the current culture. That is on the one hand probably underestimating many people's intellectual capacity, but also kind of probably overestimating, and it's a kind of weird process of those two things at the same time. I don't only have a Miss complex, but I was just traveling with Shigeru Ban. I also have a complex about every Japanese architect that is known to you. I have a Izuzaki complex, Shinohara complex, Kenzo Tanga complex. I think that the whole point of being an architect is to have these complexes and to kind of relate not to kind of single figure, but to relate to the body of thinking that you know is there. And I even find it almost tasteless to single out kind of particular ones. And of course, it was kind of really fun to, in the 80s, in the kind of period of Memphis, and where Italy seemed to be completely committed to postmodernism, and to that kind of frivolity, to declare something as humorless as an adhesion to Mies.
Yes, I'm absolutely not an architectural critic, and so I don't want to enter this issue. But I'm totally wrong if I say that Elements was, in a certain way, an homage to Mies van der Rohe, or not? What you did in Venice.
Yeah. So basically, as I try to explain, everything I do is a homage to Mies, but of course, we are all triggered by things that you know, if you're honest, are quite superficial. I think there is a number of photographs of exhibitions that Mies van der Rohe kind of organized with Lili Reich, and they seem to be unbelievably powerful in the sense that they seemingly, in a simple way and in a kind of almost naked and raw way, show almost untreated elements in their kind of pure form, and nevertheless, but maybe that is a kind of sick fantasy, emanate an enormous both creative potential and force. So yes, of course that was definitely inspired by that, but at the same time almost doing the opposite and being aware of the opposite, where in Mises' case it all kind of suggests a kind of vast potential future. In a way we were doing the opposite. We were not kind of showing the fresh materials that are yet to be put together, but we were showing the things that were put together and dismantling them and showing how maybe banal they had become in the meantime.
Great. So, thank you. I think if there are questions for the public, we are here, sure. We have a microphone, Sarah, somewhere. I have only one last question. Just to continue. I have a question which is a little bit, maybe because today I'm not very happy, so it's a little bit sad, but no, it's about how are you thinking that I mean you basically, it's something which is part of our personal future, what to do with the legacy that an architect you or as part of us could leave to the future. So just think, I understand this is a little bit personal question, but I was thinking to Pei, no? Well, probably he stopped to be part of the architectural creativity many years ago, but something like an inertia was going ahead, no? So sometimes I think, and at a different scale, so I think there are no possible comparison with what you do with OMA or what we do and so on. But should we think, just to go back to gorillas, to a kind of self-extinction, or we can believe in a possible future or something will exist without us? I don't know.
It's a very urgent question.
No, but it could become.
But I choose not to kind of really give a kind of very precise answer, because it's kind of a total blur, and
we don't simply don't
total blur. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Good, super good answer. Yeah. Please. Metti un microfono, per favore.
Mr. Koolhaas, you're one of the few major architects who seem to believe in research, having established AMO next to OMA. How do you explain this in a few words, your belief?
Well, basically, I started doing research because of the vastness of my ignorance. Yeah. Yeah. And that really is a kind of serious answer, because I think that the architects of our generation, I'm a bit older than Stefano, but were basically the first that are, and Shigeru is kind of one of those same group of architects, are for the first time kind of working all over the world, and that means that we have to confront a fantastic complexity of cultural issues and technical issues, and it means that we can learn a lot, but also that we have a lot to learn. I kind of just realized that Shigeru Ban was kind of building in Switzerland, and building, I don't want to spoil your lecture, but building kind of things in wood and saying that kind of that only in Switzerland could he learn what he learned. So I think that, you know, any thinking person at this point, and I even slightly dislike the term research, it's simply supplying or generating knowledge you need to operate in a kind of a clever way in the world.
Franco Raggi.
Hi, Rem. And some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, you wrote about the problem of the lacking of utopias. That we be, you should be concerned more about the lacking of utopias. In the 60s, 80s, there was a lot of utopian thinkings about the future of architecture and the role of architecture in the landscape. What do you think today could be the role of utopias of you have a personal one?
Well, I think that what I've at some point been kind of saying is that it's actually kind of really not a discussion about me. I think it's more a discussion about architecture, what the nature of architecture is. And what we, you know, involved in architecture over, let's say, more than kind of 5 years, but 10, 15 years, kind of realize is that architecture is never the same thing. It's never the same profession. It doesn't it cannot do the same thing at different moments. Sometimes it can do one thing unbelievably well, and that is what expected, but another thing, it stopped being able to do it. And so we are dealing with a profession that's at the same time is 5,000 years old, but that is also almost mutating with the speed of kind of contagious disease. You know, every time you look at the molecules, they are in a different configuration. And I think that the one big unspoken hope that anyone involved in this maybe complex process of content mutation has is that at some point there will be, if you can really push very hard, a connection to utopia, where or at least to a kind of better world. I think the idea that you do an architecture that does not improve something is simply unbearable. And kind of not respectful. So I think that the irony is that we derive some of our own self-worth and some of our own collective respectability or credibility clearly from this word utopia, or from this concept of utopia, even though we all of us are almost honest enough to think that at this point the connection is extremely kind of remote, and not only that, but kind of with social media, kind of fake news, whatever high tech companies, the idea that you could even launch a utopia or would be kind of perforated the moment you would launch it. But still, I think that we are all deep down having it as an important part of our chromosomes.
Other last question, maybe one last. Is there? Okay.
Thank you.
So,
Hello.
thank you.
Hello. Up.
Sorry. We don't see you. But
So I have a question. I might need to introduce a bit the context that me and other students from Piacenza, we're a big group of Latin American students, and we have all been discussing an issue that it can be introduced with what you were discussing during this talk. We were concerned on how you explained the European Union and not the European Union, the Europe context and the urban and the countryside context and the landscape and all of this. how can we interpret our Latin American cities where we can still find countryside that can still be called nature, and how can we imagine a future for, let's say, maybe Latin American is too broad of a thing to take in just one question, but maybe the future of these different kind of cities, not a city that's found in Europe, but in...
Sorry, where are you exactly from?
I am from Mexico.
Okay. So basically, I didn't mention it, but we're looking in this countryside to zooms in many different territories. We also have some zooms in South America, and that is exactly the zoom where the issue that we're looking at there. There is nature there. I was kind of referring to that when I mentioned nature remains or survives in areas that are bought by philanthropy to kind of remain presumably nature forever. But I won't go in detail, but we're looking there as well. And that seems also, I endorsed your interpretation that is the issue in South America.
It was like an act of sampling.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
can I ask one question here? On top here.
Some voice.
Yeah, this is the last question.
Up floor.
Where are you?
It's here.
Okay.
Sorry. Referring to the conversation that I really enjoyed, I just want to ask that, do you think that the role of architecture is either antagonist or protagonist in general? Because I saw the balance.
I think the moment you start, I was going to consider your question until you said in general.
That's... So I will refer it more specifically, because I saw the sort of bouncing in the conversation from different points of views, which is the main point of, let's say, the conversation, to be in contradiction. And I just want to know that is it a true, let's say, approach in architecture to look it in that way in general, like a play that different, let's say, sides are playing, or no?
I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean, but I think architecture is a kind of very malleable kind of substance, and not only that, but it can be exercised by many different characters with many different motives and for many different reasons. So I honestly believe that the question whether there's an either-or almost embedded inevitability in what architecture is incorrect. I think it can be literally countless things in the hands of countless people. So maybe I misunderstand, but in spite of being confronted with a number of kind of serious contradictions, limitations, blah, 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 I believe that architecture is, on the other hand, also a kind of very vital framework or conceptual domain to respond to many different and complicated issues. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Great. So Shigeru Bani is with us now. I think he will start the lecture in 40 minutes, so we'll anticipate 1:45, quarter to 2. Okay? Salone d'onore. Thank you again.